Okay. Hello, all. 28 August. Dis and dat information. Alyssa Battistoni's Free Gifts, Capitalism and the Politics of Nature. We're going to finish the latter half of chapter 1 today. With respect, it's beginning to make more sense to me. I hope it makes some sense to you. We left off talking about bees and architecture. The architect and the bee. And considering what makes human labor distinctive, an obvious place to begin is with Marx's most famous statement about the difference between human and non-human labor, in which he compares the worst of architects to the best of bees. This passage in Capital, the book, in which Marx emphasizes the significance of human purposiveness in production, has often been read as a ping to the specialness of human consciousness in its own right. Now, Marx recognizes that other kinds of beings engage in activities that resemble those of human beings, each affecting a change of form in the materials of nature to sustain their own form of life. The bee, like the architect, builds a home. The spider, like the weaver, constructs a web. While the resulting products have markedly different physical characteristics corresponding to the needs of different life forms, the finest cotton thread does not have the same tensile strength and stickiness as spider webs. Conversely, spider webs would serve poorly as material for human clothing. The products made by human beings are not always qualitatively superior. In some cases, the products generated by non-human activity may actually surpass those made by human beings. A bee, Marx notes, would put many a human architect to shame by the construction of its honeycomb cells. But what truly distinguishes the worst of architects from the best of bees, Marx famously claims, is the purposive intent that directs human transformations of matter. Man not only effects a change of form in the materials of nature, he also realizes his own purpose in those materials. Human beings envision what they want to make and labor in order to realize this vision. Only human beings, in other words, labor consciously. Only they intentionally make the world in their own image. Now, this is often read as part of Marx's Hegelian legacy, a celebration of spirit as it objectifies itself in the world, of a piece with the humanism articulated in the economic and philosophic manuscripts of 1844, which posits labor as the defining quality of human beings. This view has, in turn, been challenged by thinkers like Louis Althusser and looked upon skeptically by other critics of humanism. It has served as a central exhibit for ecological critics seeking to make the case that Marx is as anthropocentric as any other Enlightenment thinker, as well as for those who critique the Eurocentrism of his account of production. Yet this fable of the architect and the bee is not an account of what makes human labor valuable under capitalism specifically. Rather, it is a transhistorical account of what makes the activity of human beings distinctive from that of other kinds of beings that engage in nominally similar activities. It describes something about what we might think of as human beings' natural form. We might well want to contest the accuracy of this account of humanity, of course, or the portrait of human beings, or the portrait of non-human beings. Marx suggests here that non-human consciousness is basically non-existent, while a large body of scientific research now clearly demonstrates otherwise. Footnote 70. But it is important not to confuse this account of human distinction per se with his account of how and why human labor is organized in the production of capitalist value. And in fact, there's no obvious link between Marx's account of human labor as conscious, purposive activity and the status of human labor in the capitalist labor process. Workers on the assembly line are hardly consciously transforming the world according to their will, as in Marx's vision of the bee and the architect. Rather, their activity is being directed by the owner of the factory. As many subsequent theorists have observed, capitalism separates the conscious aspects of design from the work of execution, the work of thought from the work of construction, intellectual from manual labor. In fact, Marx often emphasizes the similarities between the use of human labor power and non-human components of the valorization process directed by capital, as when he compares the human laborer to a horse. Once hired, he notes, the capitalist has the right to use human labor power however he wishes, just as much as the right to use any other commodity, such as a horse he had hired for the day. What, then, is distinctive about human labor in the capitalist labor process? Next section, congealed quantities of homogeneous human labor, the substantialist theory of value. Now, this brings us to the second reading of Marx's view of the specialness of human labor, the idea that human labor is the substance of capitalist value. Here recall the dual character of human labor under capitalism. That is, labor has both concrete and abstract aspects, corresponding to the natural and social form of the commodity. To make a commodity as a use value requires a concrete labor process. To make, say, a table, someone has to actually hew pieces of wood into the right proportions and join them together in the right configuration. Making a table, in turn, is a totally different material process from making a ceramic mug or a loaf of bread or a microchip. This aspect of labor is concrete. It is specific to the use values it seeks to create, to the natural form of the commodity as a material good. Different kinds of labor, in turn, require different things from the human body. Deft fingers in one case, upper body strength in another, and might, as a result, put different embodied people to work. As commodities, however, these radically different products are rendered equivalent in exchange. They aren't equivalent as use values. A table and a mug serve different purposes, nor is the labor that goes into them physically comparable. Consider the difference between carpentry and pottery. This is the mystery of exchange value. The only common denominator across different commodities, Marx argues, is that some quantity of human labor has been expended to produce them. What remains is its quality of being an expenditure of human labor power, he writes. Tailoring and weaving, although they are qualitatively different productive activities, are both a productive expenditure of human brains, muscles, nerves, hands, etc. And in this sense, they're both human labor. As he states bluntly, quote, the value of a commodity represents the expenditure of human labor in general. Footnote 76. Now, what exactly does Marx mean by human labor in general? His repeated use of physiological language often seems to suggest that abstract labor is a category denoting the sheer quantity of human time and energy unified by the simple fact it's performed by human bodies, that is, brains, muscles, nerves, hands, etc. In these moments, Marx does seem to suggest that human labor is physically substantiated in the commodity itself, such that its value corresponds to the sheer amount of labor it, quote unquote, contains. He observes, for example, that values are, quote, are merely congealed quantities of homogeneous human labor, i.e., of human labor power expended without regard to the form of its expenditure. Human labor power is expended to produce them. Human labor is accumulated in them as crystals of this social substance, which is common to them all. They are values. Close quote. Footnote 78. Upon reading such passages, it's not hard to see why Marx is often thought to have a substantialist labor theory of value, one that is, by now, widely discredited. This view of labor as physically constitutive of value, however, seems incompatible with Marx's emphatic statements that value is purely social. In these passages, value sounds like a physical thing, even as Marx elsewhere insists that it's not, footnote 79. It seems, in other words, to make precisely the mistake Marx criticizes in the classical political economists of conflating natural form and social form, treating the physical substance of human labor as the source of value. Now, what is specifically capitalist about the expenditure of human physiological power, which, as Marx observes, is common across all societies? Conversely, if the basis for seeing human labor as value generating is its status as the sole common denominator between materially different goods, we could just as easily posit, as some ecological economists have, an energy theory of value in which the expenditure of energy, whether derived from human labor, power, horsepower, or fossil fuels, is the true basis of equivalence. Why, ecological thinkers ask, if nature also contributes to use value, why would only human labor produce value? Now, my argument, that is, Alyssa's argument by contrast, is that human consciousness, rather than sheer physical exertion, is key to the specialness of labor power in the category of value, but not because it imbues inert matter with human purpose, because non-humans lack consciousness, or because human consciousness is superior. Rather, it is because distinctively human consciousness underpins two core elements of capitalism's social organization of production. First, human consciousness makes possible both the class relation of labor and capital and the deployment of human labor in a wide variety of ways. Second, human consciousness underpins the social institution of wage labor and centrality of relationships mediated by the wage. This is the key. This is key to the category abstract labor. Despite Marx's occasional use of physiological language, the concept of abstract labor refers to the social commensurability of human labor measured in units of time purchased via the wage. While the way that these features of capitalism inform the organization of human social life has been much explored, they also have under-recognized implications for the status of the free gifts of nature. Next section, consciousness and social form. When it comes to the topic of human consciousness and the organization of capitalist production, more illustrative than Marx's comment on the architect and the bee is Harry Braverman's mediation on the difference between human and non-human labor in his magnum opus, Labor and Monopoly Capital. The significance of human consciousness for Braverman is not that human beings are uniquely able to make the world as they envisage it. Rather, the ability to organize production according to a conscious plan, however minimal or thwarted, is what makes the concept of social form significant at all. It means that there are many different ways that production might be organized. The ability to imagine and plan production, Braverman knows, and to communicate this plan clearly to others is also what makes possible capitalism's particular organization of production. It is what permits human beings to separate conception and execution. The bee constructs its own honeycomb cells, whether it imagines them in advance or not, but an architect designs a building for others to construct. This separation, in turn, makes possible the separation of control over the means of production from the producers, insofar as one person can instruct others in what to produce and how. This distinctive element of human consciousness is paired with a particular aspect of human embodiment, what Soren Mao describes following Joseph Fraccia as human corporeal organization. Most living beings can produce what they need to survive using only their own anatomy, although typically also in association with other beings. But humans depend on extra somatic tools, Mao observes, and this renders them uniquely vulnerable to the monopolization by others of the tools necessary for survival. Marx is emphatic that nature does not produce, on the one hand, owners of money or commodities, and on the other hand, men possessing nothing but their own labor power. People are not divided into the categories of capitalist and proletarian by nature. But if class society is not itself natural, the division of the species into classes is thinkable only for human beings. Yeah, we can talk about bees in a moment. It reflects something about the natural form of human beings, not necessarily something about human nature as it's typically understood, but the fact that only human beings have the ability to relate to one another in these terms. For Braverman, moreover, it's not purposiveness in general, but the indeterminate characteristic of human labor that renders it most fundamentally distinct from the contributions of non-human agents. When a producer employs bees in the production of honey, silkworms in the making of silk, bacteria in the fermentation of wine, or sheep in the growing of wood, Braverman notes, he can only turn to his own advantage the instinctual activities or biological functions of these forms of life. He illustrates this point with the example taken from the English engineer Charles Babbage of a workshop that used caterpillars to manufacture lace. An engineer would use food paste to trace a pattern, and the caterpillars would eat their way along it, spinning a strong but delicate web of lace as they went. Every natural agent can do things that human beings can't. But if their abilities are often extraordinary, their range is typically limited. A sheep can grow wool, but it can't knit a sweater or operate a loom. Bacteria can't be told to speed up fermentation the way a worker on the assembly line can. By contrast, recall here Soper's claim that the natural form of human beings is radically underdetermined by anatomy, physiology, and other biophysical conditions. In the sphere of production, this indeterminacy means that human beings can engage in many different kinds of concrete labor. Human beings can neither grow wool nor ferment grapes, but they can operate either a loom or a wine press. Human workers, in other words, can perform an immense variety of tasks, organized in almost countless ways. When a capitalist purchases labor power, then they aren't just purchasing a single capacity, fermentation services or wool production. They're purchasing the ability to direct someone else's action. As Andres says, de Silica, de Cilicia puts it, the right to command a certain amount of labor time. Now, if the indeterminacy of human labor is what makes it so useful, however, that indeterminacy is also what makes political struggles over the labor process so acute within class societies. Human laborers can do any number of things, but it's not guaranteed that they will. In purchasing labor power that could do much, Braverman observes, the capitalist is at the same time purchasing an undefined quality and quantity. Non-human factors of production, by contrast, buildings, materials, tools, and machinery, can generally be counted on to deliver more or less reliably. Maximizing the potential of labor power, therefore, requires intensive management, generating struggles within the labor process itself. Whoever is able to squeeze the most time out of their workers will have an advantage over their competitors, which means that capitalists are constantly trying to organize labor more efficiently, usually by exerting greater control over workers' actions. Braverman admittedly overemphasizes the instinctual elements of animal behavior, suggesting that animals act according to the universal law of nature, rather than engaging in complex social relationships of their own. But his basic points about the distinctive indeterminacy of human labor stands. A more important oversight lurks in his suggestion that non-human inputs to production simply are reliable, in contrast to unruly and disruptive human labor, and that they can therefore be used to channel and control human workers. Yet nature, too, has to be made reliable. And as we'll see, this is not guaranteed. Next section. The anthropocentrism of the wage. If human consciousness is important for the concrete organization of labor and production, it's also central to how labor power is obtained under capitalism via the particular social form of the wage. Marx argues that human labor power is a special commodity, the only commodity whose use generates new value. The definition he offers of labor power, however, does not immediately tell us why. He describes it only as the aggregate of those mental and physical capabilities existing in the physical form, the living personality of a human being, capabilities which he sets in motion whenever he produces a use value of any kind. Thus defined, labor power seems to describe something about the natural form of human beings, about human beings qua human beings. But what really makes labor power different from other elements of production is that human beings, and only human beings, at least so far, can sell the discrete and bounded use of their mental and physical capabilities existing in the physical form without selling themselves. Footnote 93. What is significant, in other words, is not only human physiological qualities, but the cognitive ability of the laborer to distinguish their ability to labor from their physical self. The useful qualities of non-human agents, by contrast, can't be separated from the person, the way that labor power can be distinguished from the laborer. It is this which makes possible capitalism's reliance on free labor in the sense of freely offered in exchange for compensation, rather than free in the sense of unpaid, or free in the sense of unconstrained, rather than the obligatory or coerced labor of serfdom and slavery. The point is not that wage labor alone defines capitalism. To the contrary, we will see capitalism relies on many kinds of ambiguously free and non-traditionally waged relations. The wage, however, is capitalism's ideal form of labor and the form that structures human relationships writ large. It is reinforced by political and legal instruments like the recognition in rights of formal equality that mark the movement from status to contract. Abstract labor itself rests on the assumed equivalence of human labor. The idea that 1 hour of human labor is fundamentally the same as any other, underpinned by juridical equality before the law. A certain structure of humanism, then, is both a precondition for the exploitation of human labor and a structure that definitionally excludes non-humans. It is through the wage, in turn, that people are connected to one another under capitalism. People work not to produce anything in particular. Indeed, labor is often divided so intensely that they may not even know what they themselves are making, but in order to earn the money with which they can purchase the goods they need to survive, which someone else has made. It is from these foundational social relations that non-humans are constitutively excluded. Non-humans, of course, may receive food or shelter in exchange for the work they perform. They may be entreated or cajoled into performing certain tasks, or genetically modified to perform still others. But the wage and money, more generally, represents a relationship among humans alone, paid not in kind, but in currency, measuring labor not in effort or effect, but in time. This is a deceptively simple but decisive point. It is the basis of the argument that value exists only as a relationship between human beings. Recognizing this need not diminish the significance and variety of non-human consciousness. Differences do not necessarily imply hierarchy, and still less do they justify domination. nor does it require a definitive account of the intelligibility of language and symbolic communication across species. We don't need to take up Wittgenstein's dictum about the lion, footnote 98. We can even accept that this kind of communication might one day be plausible, that chimps might learn to use money, or that artificial intelligence might make it possible to have conversations with whales. Though for their own sakes, we should perhaps hope not. As things stand, however, only human beings seem capable of entering into the specific forms of symbolic value construction and interpretation that characterize a system organized around exchange, mediated by the abstraction of money. If non-humans are excluded from the wage, however, they often still organized in relationship, even if indirectly. The wage, after all, reaches far beyond its recipients, as illustrated by Silvia Federici's concept of the patriarchy of the wage. Although many societies have some kind of gender division of labor, Federici observes the introduction of the wage tends to convert difference into hierarchy. Those who receive a wage for their work are exploited, but they also gain the means by which to participate in the economy and effectively in social life. By contrast, those who do not receive a wage, regardless of whether they make useful contributions to a household or a community, become dependent on those who do. Where this division of labor is gendered, as it so often is, the wage serves to reinforce patriarchal power. A similar phenomenon occurs with respect to human wage labor and the contributions of natural agents to production. In all societies, humans and non-humans have different capacities, which contribute to economic production and other kinds of social life in particular ways. But because non-humans do not, and crucially, unlike Federici's housewives, cannot receive a wage, they cannot engage in the kinds of interactions that structure social life under capitalism specifically. This inability also means that non-humans cannot express their preferences in the market, or thereby acquire the things they need to survive. An orangutan, for example, cannot outbid palm oil producers to preserve the Indonesian rainforest as a home rather than a plantation. The orangutan and other rainforest dwellers are dependent, albeit often obliquely, on human beings who value the rainforest and are willing to pay to preserve it. I call this, that is, Melissa calls this, the anthropocentrism of the wage. Now, to say that capitalism is a humanism, then, is to say that capitalism is a system that organizes a set of distinctly human capacities, the ability to exchange labor power for a wage, and the relatively equal capacities of the human body to be put to work in a variety of ways. Its defining features, privately owned means of production, wage labor, and market dependence rely on fundamentally human qualities and characteristics, with the result that its measure of value reflects human action and interests alone. Human beings are divided into capitalists and proletarians, and they relate to one another through the wage. Through commodities, they buy and sell. Non-humans, by contrast, are wageless and enter into these wageless interactions only as goods to be bought and sold. In order to obtain human labor power, capital must purchase it. Natural agents, by contrast, are freely available by default. The gifts of nature are therefore constituted as free in comparison to commodities and assessed in relation to wage labor. Importantly, then, capitalism does not intentionally or actively devalue nature per se. Rather, nature's lack of value is the shadow of the value relation that connects human laborers, the shadow of relationships among people, which themselves unfold beyond our control. The basic difficulty reflecting the interests and needs of non-humans in human social and political institutions is not a problem specific to capitalism. Other social and political orders must also face the challenge of representing non-humans, and many have limitations in their own right. Non-humans also can't vote or participate in deliberative processes, to take two obvious examples. For that matter, human societies cannot help but be anthropocentric to some degree, insofar as their decisions are always ultimately made by humans in accordance with what we can know and think. But capitalism's dynamics render it particularly unable to take the interests of non-humans into account. Let me break here for a second and, raise the standing questions, for example. Back to the text. Next section, how matter matters. So far, we've largely attended to the abstract dimensions of the free gift as a social form, while considering the ways that the natural form of human beings structures the relationships at capitalism's heart. But as I've argued, that is, as Alyssa has argued, an account that genuinely grapples with capitalism's duality can't remain in the realm of the abstract alone. It has to also attend to the concrete. Capitalism's simple logic is M-C-M prime, to convert money into more money through the production of commodities. In capitalist societies, this logic is the center of gravity into which much of the world is pulled and around which the rest of the world orbits. But if M-C-M prime begins and ends with abstract quantities, the intervening C, the commodities, means that accumulation is always underpinned by a qualitative transformation of the concrete world, as matter-energy is physically transformed in the production of the commodity itself. A tree becomes a log, becomes a plank, becomes a table. A sheep's coat becomes a ball of wool, becomes a skein of thread, becomes a woven cloth. A lump of ore becomes iron, becomes steel, becomes an automobile. The imperative of accumulation informs the material organization of commodity production, but so too the material qualities of the concrete labor process affect the prospects for accumulation. Capitalism is often portrayed as endlessly expansive, bringing everything within its scope. It can seem not only like a gravitational force, but like a black hole. It has indeed been enormously successful in organizing much of the world in pursuit of accumulation, but not uniformly or universally so. Its ability to wring profit out of every entity, activity, and process on Earth has often been overstated. Although capital seeks to absorb what it can make profitable, it abdicates that which it can't. It doesn't only appropriate and exploit, it also abandons and expels. The material qualities of concrete production processes are an overlooked feature of how and why it does so. For sheer costlessness is not the only aspect of the free gifts of nature that informs their use. While the basic qualities and abilities of human beings are, for one person to another, more or less the same, the material qualities of the vast array of non-human beings differ drastically across kinds of nature, across different organisms and species, across living beings and inanimate ones, and this affects both the manner and the degree to which they can be incorporated in capitalist production processes. Now, while all of non-human nature is equally excluded from the wage, in other words, the physical diversity of various kinds of natural forms is enormously significant in whether and how they are utilized. In particular, crucial differences appear between the gifts of nature that can be subsumed and controlled, bought and sold, and those that so far cannot. Next section. Subsumption and alienation. Two aspects of the interaction between material qualities and capitalist social relations are particularly important, outlined here and discussed in greater detail in later chapters. First, the significance of material qualities within the concrete production process, which I discuss in terms of subsumption. And second, the significance of material qualities in constituting the property relations that govern the use of nature, which I discuss in terms of alienation. The specific material content of natural agents is obviously significant in the concrete labor process. You can't make a table out of linen or a coat out of wood. Well, you could, but anyway, an ocean current won't heat a boiler, and a caterpillar won't plow a field. But these qualities also remain more significant in the valorization process than is typically acknowledged. Control over nature, as Andreas Malm observes, often serves to facilitate control over labor. In reorganizing the labor process according to its own social prerogatives, capital also physically reorganizes the material elements of production. Capital also physically reorganizes the material elements of production, what Marx describes in terms of subsumption. In some cases, it even re-engineers the physical capacities of non-human beings themselves. Sheep might be bred to produce certain qualities of wool. For example, caterpillars can produce new kinds of lace. Capitalist social forms thus directly alter the natural forms of non-human beings. But control over nature is hardly automatic and often elusive. Natural agents, too, have an autonomy of their own, one that often impedes their incorporation into production, even if only unconsciously. Just as the subsumption of human labor does not obliterate the subjective, conscious, and collective aspects of human activity, which always remain grounds for political organization and action, even the successful subsumption of nature does not obliterate the qualities of the material world itself, or the autonomy of its many and variegated entities. Subsumption is always accompanied by what Alyssa describes as supra-subsumption, the existence of matter in excess of its subordination to capital, which often constitutes obstacles to accumulation. The content of natural forms, in other words, feeds back into the appearance of social forms. Let me break here for a second, and that's a valorization question in some cases. Back to the text. Material qualities also factor into the social relations of ownership that govern access to and use of nature's gifts. For the gifts of nature are not always literally free. Although natural agents can't appear in the market in their own right, they can be represented by a human being, and more specifically, by an owner. Rent, as Marx observes, is the, quote, price paid to the owner of natural forces or mere products of nature for the right of using those forces, unquote. Footnote 105. Rents can't be said to represent non-humans in any meaningful sense. As Paul Burkett notes, they are a quote-unquote limp instrument that only ever represents a tiny part of the vast array of capacities of natural agents, and they do not, of course, compensate the natural agents themselves. Even so, it has long been proposed that nature's gifts will be valued where they are owned. And yet, many gifts of nature turn out to be remarkably difficult to represent, even through the relationship of ownership. And yet, many gifts of nature turn out to be remarkably difficult to represent, even through the relationship of ownership. Their capacities can't easily be bought and sold. They seem to elude property relations. They're not, in other words, alienable. As we will see in later chapters, some kinds of nature are so inalienable that they resist even the imposition of rents, and thus remain free in perpetuity. Much of the violence done to the non-human world, in turn, is not the result of its forceful enclosure by private owners, but of the operations of ordinary capitalism in a world and on a planet whose most fundamental processes cannot be privatized. Next section, capitalist cyborgs. At a formal level, capitalism draws stark ontological divisions between human labor and non-human resources. The free gift of nature and waged human labor exist at opposite poles. But much of the world exists along a spectrum. That is, capitalism creates cyborgs, footnote 107. Human and non-human elements are substituted for one another and combined into novel entities altogether. Together, they generate and unleash previously unknown capacities for better and for worse. This basic potential is to make and remake the world is precisely the promise Marx sees in capitalism and also the threat. Yet these novel entities are not well captured by social theory. The terms of social theory, that is, reification, naturalization, fetishism, second nature, typically seek to reveal the social lurking beneath the veil of the natural. They struggle to capture the interaction of human and more than human activity without eliminating the force of the latter. Recall Marx's claim that capital is not a thing, but a social relation between persons which is mediated through things, footnote 108. Too often, in Marxist social theories, which rightly enjoin us to attend to social relations, the things that for Marx necessarily mediate them drop out of the picture altogether. And so the materiality slips out of materialism. Similarly, Marx's analysis of commodity fetishism, central to many critiques of capitalism, addresses the way that relations among people often appear to be relations between people and things, observing that to see the likes of coats and shoes as mere objects is to obscure the ways in which they were made. Things, in this account, become mere camouflage for the social relations that actually make the world go round. But if everything is actually a social relation rather than a thing, and ultimately the same social relation at that, why does this relation take such different physical forms? Why does capitalism look so different when, say, fossil fuels come into the picture or plastics? And how does this in turn change how we, as human beings, are always both a thing and a social relation? Social relation expressed through things, that is, things that have effect in their own right. Material qualities are always socially organized, and social relations are always materially mediated. This is one of the key and often overlooked insights of Jean-Paul Sartre, whose thought we will examine more closely in the next chapter. Since human beings are quote-unquote material organisms with material needs, Sartre writes, we shall never find men who are not mediated by matter at the same time as they mediate different material regions. Footnote 109. Matter has its own disposition, which human action can reveal, channel, and reorient, but can't reconfigure entirely. It both reflects and refracts our own action. Sartre's analyses of materialized praxis and the practico-inert, Practico-inert, the practico-inert, describe the ways that human social activity and relations are expressed in and through a material world that always exceeds them. The material world channels and reflects human action, that is, in praxis, Praxis, but never only human action. Non-human nature always retains its non-identical quality, that is, the inert, inert. The practico-inert, then describes the physical trace of human actions, the sedimentation of past projects in the form of material entities that shape, enable, and constrain future action. As Frederick Jameson observes, the practico-inert describes, quote, objects which are not mere things and agencies which are not exactly people either. Close quote, footnote 112. Break. Objects may appear larger than in the mirror. Anyway, back to the text. Sartre thus anticipates an idea that has animated more recent discussions of the Anthropocene, the age in which human activity has become the dominant force shaping the planet Earth, even as that activity has begun to spin out of our control. Like Jane Bennett's heterogeneous assemblage or Bruno Latour's hybrids, the practico-inert reflects a view of matter as reactive but not perfectly malleable. Unlike either, it resists the temptation to flatten differences between agents, instead retaining an account of distinctively human action at its core. Footnote 113. It is better understood in terms of what I call, here we go again, the practico-actant, that is, practico-actant, practico-actant, in reflection of the dynamic and autonomous rather than passive and compliant character of the more than human world. Like the Marxist concepts of alienation and reification, meanwhile, the practico-actant attends to the way that social relations come to appear as things, while taking things themselves more seriously, attending to the way that human actions and social relations manifest physically. Materiality without morality. Next section. Now, to recognize that the more than human world exists in excess of human projects is not to valorize the unknowability or otherness of nature as such. Matter's unruliness and vibrancy are often suggested to be morally significant forms of resistance to capitalist abstraction. Nature's dynamism and autonomy are framed as forms of quasi-political rebellion. The material world does exceed capitalism's forms of logic. It often does resist, impede, or otherwise fail to conform to capital's attempts to harness and reorganize it. See nuclear power. But this is not the same as standing outside of capitalism. Even aspects of nature that resist subsumption and alienation do not necessarily escape the reorganization of the broader web life by capitalist social forms, as discussed in Chapter 6 in particular. In any case, identifying the places where nature is or is not amenable to capitalist remaking should not in itself give cause for celebration or condemnation. The fact of physical resistance should not be conflated with political prescription. Our response to the troublesome mediation of capitalist social forms should not be the simple affirmation of an unmediated world of nature against any interpretation by the social, an impossible task in any case. Capitalism situates nature in one way, but we never simply relate to nature directly, without the necessarily anthropocentric apparatus of meaning. The critique of capitalism, then, must focus specifically on how it assigns meaning, rather than criticizing the fact that it does so at all. Indeed, nature's non-identity, its existence beyond the concepts and practices we use to organize it, is not a challenge only for capitalism. All social orders must contend with and rely on a world they did not make and cannot control, comprising entities ranging from minerals deposited by asteroids that have randomly collided with the Earth to rapidly evolving microbes. Footnote 117. This basic fact is as likely to foil the social orders we think liberatory as those we think oppressive. It is vital, as that is, Alyssa argues more directly in Chapter 7, not to see the force of the non-human world only as a limit on human freedom. It is always simultaneously a condition of possibility and constraint. But as such, nature's recalcitrance must be assessed in relation to our projects and ends. Nature's autonomy is not just evidenced in the heartening examples of life that rebels against the value/monoculture nexus of modernity, or the characteristic organisms like mushrooms that seem to have eluded capitalist rationalization. Footnote 118. It lies, too, in more sobering reminders of the way that the world really isn't under human control. The possibility, for example, that the monsoon might fail one year, or that climatic conditions could change drastically even without human alteration, as indeed they frequently have in the last 100,000 years. Darn those chemtrails. Thus, while I emphasize remainders and residues, excesses and superfluidities, the rough edges of the physical world that capitalist discipline has failed to smooth, I do not see these sites as sites of non-capitalist social relations, political resistance, or moral value in themselves. Footnote 120. Rather, I see the sites where value snags on the material world as places where cracks in the seemingly smooth armor of value appear, and where different political possibilities appear more readily. The free gift is a site where the disjuncture between capitalism's form of value and other kinds is most visible, and where judgments about it are perhaps more easily made. But these judgments can't be outsourced to nature. Rather than simply affirming nature against capital, a politics of nature must instead attend to the values that diverge from capitalism's own and seek to widen the cracks. To repeat that, rather than simply affirming nature against capital, a politics of nature must instead attend to the values that diverge from capitalism's own values and seek to widen those cracks. The next chapter takes up this challenge in more detail, considering how we might criticize capitalism without seeking refuge in nature. Needless to say, that covers a whole pile of humanist activity. All right, so I finally got to the end of chapter 1. I've been reading and completing chapter 1 of Theory of Free Gift from Alyssa Battistoni's Free Gifts, Capitalism and the Politics of Nature. That was chapter 1. 2 days ago, we started with the introduction. We will subsequently follow up tomorrow with chapter 2, which it would, and lest you think this is unimportant or uninteresting, needless to say, there are complications and problematic elements in her discourse that perhaps raise more questions than provide answers, but it gives us a certain structural approach, I would assert, to certain things that certainly can be reanalyzed or reconfigured or reproblematized. For example, if you want to assert the anthropocentrism of the wage, I think there's a lot there, but it has, it's a real critical discourse problem in the 21st century. Needless to say, it's not unaddressable, and I would hope that you can think through this chapter that there's lots of other little questions percolating. There's an argument from design. There's certain arguments about the role of material. There's arguments about the larger question of perhaps, if you're into that kind of thing, Gaia or other kinds of other constructions of the globe. So there's all kinds of things going on here, and I hope that this will encourage you to read the remainder. Let me say then that I'm at the end of my particular time, and I shall shut off the live stream